Been doing it for quite some time, Senator Cantwell and I, in our bipartisan bill that we worked to move last session, last Congress, I think really laid the groundwork for some of the good infrastructure pieces when we think of energy. During his State of the Union address, President Trump called for a renewed focus on our nation's infrastructure. And again, here at Energy, we've been working to improve our nation's energy infrastructure for the past several years, largely focusing on the roadblocks that hinder responsible development, challenges related to cybersecurity, and the pursuit of innovative technologies. Our nation's energy delivery systems have benefited from significant innovation over the years, and today's hearing will put current infrastructure opportunities into perspective by examining how America's energy, from production to generation to distribution, have evolved over time. This is an opportunity to look at what we have, how we came to have it, and to examine which policies helped the effort. I often think back to the development of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline during the 1970s. Prudhoe was the largest oil field ever discovered in North America, but we needed a way to transport the oil from the remote North Slope. After much study and debate, Alaskans determined that a pipeline was our best option, which required congressional approval in the midst of an oil crisis. Since TAPS came online in 1977, the 800-mile pipeline has successfully transported more than 17 billion barrels of oil from the North Slope to an ice-free port in Valdez. More than half of the pipeline runs above ground, which is a necessity given Alaska's prevalent permafrost terrain, but really it is truly an engineering marvel. It's a lifeline for Alaskans. It creates jobs, provides revenues, and has enabled the creation of our permanent fund. It's also a critical national security asset for all Americans, particularly those along the West Coast. Today's technologies like fracking have allowed us to reach oil and gas resources that were previously unattainable. And technological improvements like horizontal drilling have enabled industry to shrink their footprint while reaching resources miles away from the drill site. One thing that hasn't changed is that we still need pipeline to deliver these resources to refineries and natural gas plants. It's just unfortunately become a little bit harder to build them. Perhaps no asset has seen more innovation and evolution than our nation's energy grid. I think we all recognize that the grid is no longer just an energy delivery system for large, centralized generation assets. Distributed generation, microgrids, and energy storage now bring electricity closer to home, changing the way consumers interact with their electricity providers. And at the same time, we've seen significant changes in energy consumption. Efficiency improvements and retrofits allow us to use less energy to power and heat at greater space at a lower cost. In some of Alaska's more remote communities, simply by switching streetlights to more efficient LEDs, we have seen savings in tens of thousands of dollars annually. Layered on top of the infrastructure evolution is the digital revolution. The increased digitalization of our nation's energy delivery system provides numerous benefits. Real-time monitoring can allow for system optimization and identify potential issues in their earliest stages. Better data assists consumers in making informed choices about their energy usage. And at the same time, increasing the amount of internet connections also increases the number of access points, which can leave our critical infrastructure vulnerable to potential bad actors. Determining how best to secure our infrastructure from ever-increasing cybersecurity threats is one of the biggest security challenges that face our nation today. As we consider the evolution of energy infrastructure, it's impossible to ignore the impact of government policy. There have been times when Congress has made a positive impact, such as recognizing again the value of TAPS during an energy crisis, but too often we have seen failed government attempts to impose outcomes or perhaps pick winners and losers, and we don't always pick the winners. It is important, then, that we use the lessons learned from the past to inform future congressional actions. We've got a distinguished panel of witnesses here today. I'll introduce them all in a moment, but now let me turn to Ranking Member Cantwell for your comments. Thank you, Mr. Santa. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for your comments and what you have provided, not only from a historical perspective, but how we might move forward. Mr. Allen, I am intrigued with the what you've outlined for the potential for demonstration projects in rural Alaska. We had an opportunity to kind of describe the situation in many of my communities that are not only not part of a broader grid They are the very definition of what a true microgrid is. And Mr. Moeller, you mentioned in your testimony that initially, back in the day, we began as basically distributed microgrids, and in many cases, I feel in Alaska, we're going back to the future. We're letting you know what it's like to be that little independent microgrid, but I would welcome you to come to Alaska, to come out to some of our rural communities, and then give us your insight and guidance. I've got an Imagineer at Chena Hot Springs that I think the two of you could share some very interesting ideas about how we might be able to demonstrate at a very small level in our remote and rural communities some of the innovations that are out there. So I would welcome you to that. Great. I want to ask a question to both you, Mr. Moeller, and to you, Mr. Santa, with regards to comments that are made in your written statement. And I'll begin with you first, Mr. Santa, because you make a statement and said, quote, "The U.S. natural gas transmission pipeline industry has been funded entirely with private capital?"
That is correct.
I think that is important to highlight, not only to the committee but to others, but to recognize that not all solutions require federal involvement, federal funding. As we talk about an infrastructure package here, there's no shortage of ideas as to what might go into a broader economy-wide infrastructure package. What it all comes down to is how are we going to pay for it? And so when we understand that, in fairness, what we have seen with some very significant infrastructure has been a level of investment within the industry that demonstrates that given the right investment climate, these projects can proceed. Mr. Moeller, you have also suggested, you made a statement that, again, we don't often see here in testimony before Congress. You said EEI members are not advocating for additional federal funds for transmission investment. And again, I want to highlight that because same situation, not all solutions necessarily require federal funding. So if I can ask the two of you in terms of the necessary investment climate for whether those in the natural gas transmission industry to be able to proceed with projects or your members within EEI to be able to proceed to projects, what is it that can and should be done to ensure that we have that necessary investment climate to allow for these particular investments?
I would begin by saying I think what the investors in pipelines need and the investors more broadly in energy infrastructure is certainty and predictability. In my testimony, I talked about the Natural Gas Act framework and how favorable that has been to encouraging private investment to develop the infrastructure to support this industry. What we have now, though, is, and I noted there are multiple other permits that are required. That permitting process, I think, can be coordinated more without violating the purposes of many of those statutes that are intended to protect the environment and various resources. So I would encourage, as a complement to whatever may be done on publicly funded infrastructure in a bill, to also look with an eye toward what can be done to improve permitting for infrastructure.
So permitting, certainty, coordination. Mr. Moeller?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The written statement that I have elaborates more on this, but similarly to what Mr. Santa said, citing and permitting reform and certainty and accountability, along with the emphasis on cooperative federalism so that one state doesn't deny the benefits to the citizens and customers of many other states in infrastructure that really is affecting interstate commerce is important. Specific to the investment climate at FERC, there are some good challenges FERC has based on a period of interesting monetary policy where the formula that was come up with that was rejected by the courts are frankly not putting the commensurate return given the risk of transmission investments. The Commission has to deal with this. We've got a white paper out that's trying to help them on that, and I'll happily give you copies of it. In addition, there's serial complaints, the 15-month issue I mentioned. There's the capping of transmission incentives, which I think is probably counter to the intent of Congress from the 2005 Act. And then the ongoing very general issue of cost allocation on these multi-decade assets where figuring out who pays how much, there's a lot of art and science in that because flows change over the decades, but adding more certainty very generally to that will improve the investment climate.
Very good. Thank you both.